And we're live. Welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. I'm Salvador Cordova, your host and founder of this channel. This channel caters especially to Christians who are graduate students and researchers in the scientific fields. That's partly because that is my background as well, and I tend to relate to people who are like me, just like probably everyone else. And so the content is kind of driven by a little bit, unfortunately, with my tastes, which are probably atypical of the general population. So we talk a lot about creation science on this channel. I am a professing evangelical Christian with mostly reformed interpretation of the scriptures, and I believe the cosmos and the earth are young. I was raised in a Roman Catholic home and accepted evolutionary theory as it was taught to me in high school and grade school, but I eventually became a creationist shortly after I became a Christian. So there was about 1 year I would be what would be called a theistic evolutionist. And then I became an old earth creationist. And after getting a degree in applied physics, I became a young earth creationist. And each year I've become more convinced that is the case. I will share some of the reasons here. And for 7 years, I was a molecular biophysics researcher, research associate for world famous geneticist and Cornell research scientist John C. Sanford. So tonight, it's going to be a bit of a variety show. And since it's late, I'm going to try to end the show in a reasonable amount of time. I just, unfortunately, I have some sleep disorder issues where apparently the way my system processes sunlight is the reverse of the normal. And so I have a really hard time turning in at night, and I'm always sleepy during the day. It has nagged me throughout most of my professional career. And a lot of days I spend the time just being like a zombie. And you know, I get home, I crash for a little bit, and then I wake up and I'm just like up all night. It's just a terrible way to live, and that was reinforced all the more when I had to care for my beloved and but elderly and disabled mom. I don't regret the 18 years I took care of her after Dad died, but unfortunately it only reinforced kind of my abnormal sleep patterns, which makes life very difficult for me. As you'll notice, my background is the green screen here. I have about 4 locations in the house from where I filmed my shows, and this is the winter location. When it gets really, really cold, I'll film from here because there's no point in heating the entire house just to when I only need heat in one room. So we got a taste of spring recently, and I was able to film where I like to, but we'll have a few more weeks of winter. So what's on the docket today? It's going to be a little bit of reading from an article about Jordan Peterson. Then a little bit why I'm a young earth creationist. I'll be covering the book Solar System Evolution, which, here it is. Which ironically, according to the author, was written to fight creationism, and he couldn't have written a better book to persuade me that the solar system was created. And if the solar system is created, doesn't matter whether there are millions or billions of years, it has all these basic mechanical problems that can't be explained with time, chance, and gravity. A better explanation is instantaneous creation. So then the only question then is how old is it? Can we look at markers that indicate that it's young? And as the years have gone by, it's become more and more persuasive. The data indicate youth in the solar system. There are still some problems in being particularly radiometric dating to establish that the solar system is young. Now, that's formally a separate question from the age of the entire universe and the entire cosmos. But I think I'm getting the sense that there may be breakthroughs in understanding the formation of isotopes and an explanation of what may be the appearance of age is actually a misinterpretation based on our understanding of nucleosynthesis. And if that's the case, the age of the Earth, the major barrier to the age of the solar system, that being radiometric decay and daughter products, could be on the way to being solved. And if that's the case, the youth of the solar system would be very, very well established at some point in the not too distant future. I would not want to be on the other side of the argument that argues that the solar system is billions of years. So I'll share some of my reasoning for that. And again, this is separate from the question of the entire universe being young, which I think is going to be the last frontier of young Earth, young cosmos, creationism. It is a very difficult problem because for the most part, we are looking for naturalistic answers, and that's okay for the problem of distant starlight. Whereas for the origin of life and for the emergence of all the variety and complexity, creationists will simply invoke miracles. That is justified on a number of levels, and I think James Stuart did a good job of just absolutely making an example and beating up Dave Farina, who really looked like a total idiot, honestly. Just one last administrative announcement. I had a conversation with my colleague, Rebecca Davis, and it's kind of funny when you see us on the same show together. We get along, but sometimes backstage we will confront each other and say, I didn't like that. And she'll say, yeah, I didn't like that either, what you said, Sal. And we've had to do some refilmings because we would disagree on the content and how it was communicated. Usually, and I'd say actually every case that I could think of, by and large, when we have been able to confront each other and disagree, sometimes sharply, and come to some sort of middle ground between the two of us, the shows end up usually being excellent. But we've had to go through some refilming of the shows, a couple iterations. And one of the things that came out of my recent discussions with her is the idea of branding and expectations of what a channel will be. And I have 4 channels right now. One of them is about McLean Bible stuff, because about a third to half the subscribers actually came to this channel because of my coverage of the ongoing drama at McLean, as you could see here at the ticker. My pastor, who tried to get me arrested and thrown in jail and dragged through the courts, that never happened. But now he is facing a jury trial on grounds that he had rigged elections illegally and done a lot of other things. It could come out that there are even more skeletons in the closet during this process, where he will be deposed and have to speak under oath, as well as likely many of his staff and former staff. And this should be interesting. I have already said that if federal money was involved, and it was misappropriated, those are felony counts. So to protect the brand of this channel, which is exploring evidence and reasons for the Christian faith, to help maintain it, I'm having to separate out some of the content to other channels, and that's not going to happen tonight. That migration will happen slowly. Also, some of the extremely nerdy content will probably have to be moved to the academic channel, because some of those are just pure chemistry, physics, statistics, genetics, you name it type material, and maybe even some of the peer-reviewed journal readings are just a little bit too much. I've noticed that I've lost subscribers in the process of sometimes these very grueling sessions where I would just go on for hours. Sometimes with Emory, we would be reading through technical journals, doing a public reading. It's been fruitful, but it may not serve the brand. It's not that the material won't exist, but what I'm trying to present to the audience is hopefully something that's a little bit more appealing to the general tastes. And so, again, I'm trying to fine tune the branding of my channel. This discussion kind of came about because Rebecca is also thinking about the mission and branding of her channels. So that discussion came about today, and I realized, well, I could give her some of my ideas of what I think would be helpful for her, but I realized that was definitely applicable to myself and my conduct and my content decisions for this channel. So I can't tell you why I really like Jordan Peterson. I've really pondered, and it's like, well, he may be a Christian now. We don't know. It's hard to tell. His daughter accepted Christ recently and said a lot of miracles were associated with her conversion. And Jordan Peterson has seemed to embrace the Christian message. And even if he didn't completely believe it, he certainly tried to live it. Because the alternative is to be some sort of nihilist. As it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if the dead are not raised, if Christ is not raised, your faith is in vain. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And there are no answers in atheism to find hope and meaning and purpose in life. To say that atheism will provide that is a non sequitur and therefore false claim. One atheist, Randolph Richardson, said there are no answers in atheism. I don't remember his exact wording, but that was essentially the point. And I call that Richardson's principle, that there are no answers in atheism. And so Peterson has articulated then, what are the alternatives? And for him, even when he found church distasteful, he found it, he could either choose to be a nihilist or live his life as if God existed. That was his subtle position, which is basically a faith position, because the alternative would be to be a nihilist. And that didn't sit well with him. Somewhere deep inside him, there was a moral sense that this isn't the way to live life. And for that reason, I think that spark to love the Christian faith has remained, even though he didn't like the church experience. Surprisingly, that resonates with me, because there are a lot of things in church over the years in my dealing with the clergy that have been extremely distasteful, and also dealing with other parishioners. There is a lot of bullying, there's a lot of non sequiturs, a lot of shaming, a lot of use of social pressure to instill quote unquote faith. And if one's faith is built through social pressures and just the equivalent of brainwashing, I wouldn't regard it as true faith in the sense of a faith built on facts, evidence, reasons, and really rational reasons for believing. And so it's been kind of a difficult history with me and clergy, and having a pastor trying to get me thrown in jail, threatening me with armed security and arrest and county police. That's only reinforced kind of my negative perception of the clergy, who may be preaching one thing and practicing another. And in the church I was a part of before that, the pastor was caught beating his wife and kids. So it's kind of hard to conceive of someone preaching the love of Christ, and that Christ, how Christ had sacrificed himself for the church. It says in Ephesians, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. That doesn't seem to be consistent with the behavior of some of these preachers. And I struggle a lot that when I ask difficult questions about why it's reasonable to believe, I would get very hostile responses. My questions would not be answered. I'd go to books that didn't answer the question, and I got very disgusted with it. And so I ended up hanging out with atheists. The irony is, when I spent time with the atheists, that was the thing that drove me back to Christianity when I nearly left 20 to 22 years ago. Why is that? In mathematics, we have this thing called proof by contradiction. You assume the thing that you're trying to disprove is true. So there are any number of ways to illustrate this, but maybe one example is like, if I said tornadoes passing through a junkyard can assemble a 747, you end up realizing that's an absurd conclusion. Therefore, tornadoes passing through a junkyard will not assemble a 747. And you analyze all the mechanics of it, and you say, that's just ridiculous. We call that reductio ad absurdum. And let me see. Oh, statistics for narcissism shows that pastors are in the top 5 careers where we find narcissists having along with CEOs. Sad to know. God bless you, Sister Janet Duttridge. Much love to you. My prayers go out to you. And sorry, people know that I tear up easily. That's just whatever gave me my intelligence also kind of overdeveloped my nervous system, and I tend to be just overly sensitive, and that's embarrassing since I'm a guy. We're not supposed to be that emotional. I do have definitely guy traits in the sense of not being emotional, in the sense that I'm able to compartmentalize things. So you'll definitely see me shift gears between being very emotional and just being really cold. That seems to be a guy trait. Good example of that is when I was having a hard time landing an airplane, I could have died. I was cool as can be trying to land it. After I landed, I shook. And that's not unusual for pilots, and especially those who fought in war. They said they felt no fear while they were getting shot at, but when they landed the airplane and thought about it, then they started to shake. There's just something about the way guys process stress, where they can kind of just like contain it for a little bit, for a while, and then it's kind of deferred, and then it expresses itself. I don't know how much that could be related to post-traumatic stress syndrome, but yeah, you know. Anyway, I got a little emotional when I said, Janet, I'm praying for you. There are some women the local area who are in my congregation who are suffering all sorts of loss and difficulty, loss of loved ones and health ailments. And I sent a letter expressing condolences to a friend. She just recently lost her father, and she's in the hospital just fighting for her life. And my heart just went out to her. Praise the Lord that she's a Christian. So Janet, I'm praying for you too. And it is such a blessing to see you again. So, yes. So this thing about narcissism, I did not know that. Pastors are in the top 5 careers where we find narcissists, having along with CEOs. Now, I think it's okay. I mean, a CEO has to have a certain character, and be tough-minded to move forward. The problem with pastors being narcissists is that they've tended to be sometimes also actors and hypocrites. That they will try to get people to admire them, and it's not really who they are, and that's not good. So those are my feelings, and I have encountered too many of this clergy. It's not really. It tends to be a little bit of a personality cult that draws the people to the church. And yeah, this is why I've struggled with this. How was I restored back to Christianity? It was spending time with the atheists and realizing they had nothing to offer. I would take what little scraps of faith I had. If there was even a chance that Christianity was right on evidential grounds, that was better than nothing, and I would pursue it. And I've not regretted that decision one iota. And the longer that I have, as the decades have transpired since I was restored and decided to go back to Christianity, I've not regretted it. The evidential trail has gotten stronger with each passing year, and seems even passing day and even minute, because we keep discovering more things. And then the other thing is, there's things like what Jordan Peterson points out, and I can't tell you why it resonates with me. It just does. He has kind of an understanding of human nature that I've not found in hardly any pastors. And so when he talks about good and bad, and even quotes the Bible and its concept. It's like some days I think he grasps it. He grasps some of the elements of Christianity better than I've ever been taught by the clergy and seminarians. He seems to understand human nature also very well. And there are lessons I've been learning from him that I said I wish I'd known decades ago, and my life would have been far more meaningful. And sometimes I think the thing that he does is he acknowledges human nature, both the good and the bad. And it seems when he speaks to the deepest human needs. And I can't put my finger on it. I will tell you what I found distasteful is I was going to one Baptist church for almost 12 Sundays in a row. Rather than trying to feed the flock, they just said, go out there and preach the gospel. And that's fine. That's what the Bible teaches. But every Sunday, it's like, do you define the Christian life by preaching? Is that all you do? Can you explain why the gospel should be meaningful to me? That's the basics. How can I preach the gospel if you don't explain why it is meaningful to my everyday life and how I should live it, other than just by assertions? Can you describe why it's meaningful to me. And Peterson does that. There's something that just deeply resonates, and you're like, yeah, I get it. And so let me read from this article. And even an atheist was able to pick up on this. So I'll give you the title of the article, and I think I put it in the video description. If I hadn't already, I'll try to. It says, the author here says, I first came across Peterson, not in any political context, but as a teacher of story. His online videos contain extensive deconstructions of narratives and myths, both ancient and modern. I watched his videos on the psychological significance of biblical stories. Although I am a lifelong atheist, for the first time, the Bible started to make symbolic sense to me. I'll read that again. Although I am a lifelong atheist, for the first time, the Bible started to make symbolic sense to me. That's exactly my feeling. The Bible did make sense of a lot of things, but Peterson brought it to, added something that I didn't have anywhere else. I'm just like, I never thought of that before. And the title of this article resonated with me this last week, and I stumbled on it. The title of the article is The Pursuit of Happiness is a Pointless Goal. The pursuit of happiness is a pointless goal. I wish I could kill those ads. And the picture of Jordan Peterson with the lobsters there, that's because the first chapter of his best-selling book, The 12 Rules for Life, is about lobsters and how they're wired like humans. And we've learned a lot about human psychology by studying lobsters. And it was very provocative. And so that's the title of the article. It was by, I believe the gentleman's name is Tim Lott. Let me just verify that. Tim Lott, okay. So we'll start from kind of Peterson's kind of like non-believing, I'll just figuratively say pagan viewpoint. And if you recall, Paul framed the sharing of the gospel in Acts 17 from a starting point of the pagan worldview, which is astounding. Because many Christians will say, no, you have to start with the right worldview, and then you'll see things correctly. And I'm just like, well, that's a catch-22, because if you need the right worldview to see the truth, then you're never going to find it if you're not already there to begin with. The way I read the New Testament is that God's presence and his working in people's life is so strong that you can start with the wrong worldview, and then you'll be set straight. Just like Paul on the road to Damascus. You can be taken from the wrong worldview and shown the light to the right worldview. Sometimes God will use your distorted pagan viewpoints and make you realize where you are isn't the right place. I talked about proof by contradiction in mathematics. It's the same line of reasoning. Famous proof by contradiction in mathematics, you can look it up to deal with the square root of 2 is a very interesting approach. It was my experience dealing with atheists that that led to a proof by contradiction. I realized if I accepted the atheist worldview, it became meaningless. And yet they seem to be making arguments. You have to assume meaning even exists. It just, I said, this is an incoherent worldview, and which means it's irrational. And I said, okay, either all this is an accident or meaning is real. For you to be making rational arguments, you have to assume meaning exists. And meaning exists if there's a God. If there's no God, it's hard to justify that meaning is anything but an illusion. And that wasn't satisfying to me. So, all this preface, I don't agree with everything Jordan Peterson says, especially his evolutionary biology viewpoint. Okay, so just have a little filter there and filter out what you don't like and what you feel is unbiblical. But I will share how sometimes he'll resonate things that some Christians might find revolting, but then you find passages in the Bible that agree with it. So, by the way, is my audio halfway decent? I hope it's not clicking too much. I may have to stop the banner here. That might help the audio. And I'll continue the reading here. It is uncomfortable to be told to get in touch with your inner psychopath, that life is a catastrophe and that the aim of living is not to be happy. This is hardly the staple of most self-help books, and yet superficially at least, a self-help book containing these messages is what the Canadian psychologist Jordan B. Peterson has written. Okay, the inner psychopath. There is a passage in Ecclesiastes, and let me try to look it up here. Ecclesiastes 9:3. Insanity remains in their hearts, that is, in human hearts. Insanity remains in human hearts while they are alive, and then they go on to join the dead. Insanity remains in human hearts while they are alive, and then they go to join the dead. That's very sobering. So after the fall of man from the Garden of Eden, there's an element of dysfunction on every level. And having defended and studied and defended the genetic entropy hypothesis, that's becoming more evident. We're suffering mental deterioration. And so there's some things that are very unflattering. The other thing is the inner psychopath that tells us we have a heart of evil. And the Bible is trying to tell you you're not inherently good. Peterson used the word Hobbes or something, which I think contrasted with Voltaire, who said that, we were born inherently good and then we got corrupted. Hobbes, I think, if I'm misquoting, someone can correct me, that we have a mix of being good and bad. And I think that's accurate. You can find biblical justification, like when Jesus was saying, even you being evil know how to give good gifts to your son. There's an element where you know what the right thing is, even if you're evil. And so the inner psychopath is saying, okay, there's some things that are very dark about human nature that all of us don't want to admit. So I have to take care of a bot here, or if someone can blast him. Thank you. Whoever zapped him, who was that? Janet, God bless you, sister, for shooting down that bot. Anyway, so this is why this resonated. How many pastors will tell you that you have an inner psychopath? Because it's kind of painful to think how dark your heart could be. And Jordan Peterson is like, okay, he's not mincing words because he's a clinical psychologist. He knows how dark everyone's life can be deep down. And if you're in the right circumstance, it's kind of scary what kind of monster you could turn out to be. Christianity has helped us to deal with that evil nature, and this is where real civilization has flourished. Even atheists will tell you, some of them, not all of them, that they feel comfortable in a truly Christian country where there's honesty and integrity. When those values are upheld, when true Christian values are upheld, they would feel safe in that society. Okay, so again, going back to Peterson, his book, The 12 Rules of Life, An Antidote to Chaos, is an ambitious, some would say hubristic attempt to explain how an individual should live their life, ethically rather than in the service of self. It is informed by the Bible, Nietzsche, Freud, Jung, Dostoevsky. Again, uncommon sources for the genre. And that may sound strange, but again, going back to this whole thing in mathematics of proof by contradiction, sometimes you start with the wrong stuff to point you in the right direction. Of anything I learned in mathematics, that was one of the most startling things, that you can arrive at truth by starting with the wrong premises. And when you realize that leads to a contradiction, then you know that your premise was false. So some of the things, if you look at some of those pagan and non-Christian sources in that light, it points to the failure of an atheistic viewpoint. Some of it, unfortunately, would be definitely classified as heretical, and I'm just letting you know that, okay, that I don't endorse everything there, but I'm trying to just say, sometimes you can be more convinced that Christianity is being true when you realize the other stuff is bad. So let's go on. I doubt it, that is Jordan Peterson's book, I doubt it has the commercial appeal of The Secret. Wish for something and it will come true. And it certainly strays markedly from the territory of how to win friends and influence people. But then Peterson is in a different intellectual league from the authors of most such books. Camille Paglia estimates him to be the most important Canadian thinker since Marshall McLuhan. Peterson, 55, and this is an older article, is a psychology professor at University of Toronto who shot into the headlines in 2016, refusing to use gender-neutral pronouns at the university, which new legislation, Bill C-16, compelled him legally to do. Following this, he was either hailed as a free speech martyr or castigated as a transphobe. Demonstrations broke out on campus, and he has been the subject of a campaign of protests by trans activists. More controversy when he publicly defended James Darmore, the sacked Google employee who suggested there were innate gender differences as being no more than the scientific consensus. And let me show you, see, this is you could see the protest here. So again, why did Peterson resonate? Have I seen any pastors suffer as much persecution as Peterson for standing up to this imposition of trying to change our language with pronouns? To him, he said, tell the truth, defend the truth, prevent the distortion of language that will sow confusion. You can't communicate the truth if you so distorted language, it starts to become meaningless to say anything. And that was a larger fight against postmodernism, that he's waged. And then it's like he's getting persecuted for saying there's differences between men and women. When was the last time I've seen pastors really take as much flack as he did? Because he's on the front line in academia. That's why he is held with admiration for some of us, because he stood where, like in my case, we see pastors just beating their wives and children and then abusing their congregation, financial misdealings. I started to get sick of what I was seeing in Christian clergy, and they preach one thing, practice another, and that would probably include even missionaries. You know, I could go on a tirade on that. It probably wouldn't be productive. But that's why it caught my attention. I said, this puts a lot of Christians to shame. He showed more moral fiber not being a Christian, standing to defend Christian principles. And for that, I really admired him. And I think that's why it resonated. It's like he's living the Christian life on some levels, not all, that I respect. And there are a few things he had to say in his book, The 12 Rules for Life, that resonate with a lot of guys. 80% of the people that listened to him at one point were guys. And if you're wondering, well, what did he possibly say? Some of it is really practical. He said, well, if you're going to go out and tell people how to change, you know, how to live better lives, why don't you start living your life better? Why don't you clean your room, organize it? He said, it's just ridiculous. We have these young people going out in the street protesting, talking about global change and all these movements. They can't even do something as simple as maintaining their room. That doesn't make sense. That resonated with me. Take care of yourself before you try to straighten someone else's life out, much less the entire world. And I was like, okay. And Jesus said, you know, don't try to take the speck out of your brother's eye when you have a plank in your own. And that message resonated with me. It resonated with a lot of guys. A message that doesn't resonate quite so well with guys, honestly. Oh, let's preach the gospel and get everyone to love each other and get along. I mean, it's just, sorry. As a guy, that just never resonated. Peterson up there saying, grow up, get your life together. I said, that actually sounds, yeah, it's like, thanks, coach. I can't tell you why that resonated with me. I mean, it's kind of that tough medicine. And I didn't find it completely insulting. I wasn't insulted or offended. It's like, I appreciated someone saying, this is what you got to do. It's going to be a tough job. You got to do it. And something inside said, yeah, he's right. I need to tell myself that. So, and more than one person has said, if they had more people like Peterson in the pulpits, more people would be going to church. He certainly doesn't sit well with the usually left-leaning academic establishment. Apart from anything else, he believes most university humanities courses should be defunded because they have been corrupted by neo-Marxist postmodernists, particularly women's studies and black studies. This has led him to be branded a member of the alt-right, although his support for socialized healthcare, redistribution of wealth towards the poorest, and the decent criminalization of drugs suggests this is far from the whole story. He defines himself as a classic British liberal, but he also says when challenged for being a reactionary, that being a reactionary is the new radicalism. Peterson has largely been in the news for his blazing, outspoken opposition to much of the far-left political agenda, which he characterizes as totalitarian, intolerant, and a growing threat to the primacy of the individual, which is his core value, he asserts, the foundation of Western culture. You know, it's been disgusting to see Marxism and all these woke things invading the Christian church. And it takes someone who's outside the Christian church to shame, to put a lot of what's happening, particularly in Christendom, to shame them. And that's why I'm beginning to realize why, just in this, looking at this article, he resonates. So now, I'm not going to read the rest of the article right now. I'll get to the crux of the title. The pursuit of happiness is a pointless pursuit. What was the title exactly? I mean, there are various ways he said this, but some of his videos on this topic are just heart-wrenching. The pursuit of happiness is a pointless goal. The pursuit of happiness is a pointless goal. And from a non-Christian perspective, this is really difficult. From a Christian perspective, it really does resonate. Jesus said, if you wish to follow me, take up your cross. Deny yourself and take up your cross daily. Deny yourself and take up your cross daily. And for a lot of my life, I don't like that verse, and it doesn't resonate. It's like, God, this doesn't make sense. Don't you want me to be happy? I mean, wouldn't a loving God try to make me happy? And it's been a long road to figuring out, okay, why would a loving God put me through this? Short answer, 2 Corinthians 4:17. For this momentary light affliction is building for us an eternal weight of glory. So from the non-Christian perspective, Peterson could still see that this is true. Why did he say that? Why did he say the pursuit of happiness is a pointless goal? And if you study some of his other works, it's really common sense. He said, for one, if you really love someone, if you have a loving heart, you may see them die. That's something you can't help. You will have to be able to carry on when you've lost someone you deeply loved. If your pursuit was to be happy because that person will be with you forever, if you outlive them, you're going to be unhappy. And that's just really like, oh, duh. But you can extend that to so many other things. That life will throw things you don't want, that you have no control over, that will bring unhappiness in your life. Happiness does not, you can't prevent yourself from having unhappiness enter your life. The harder you try to pursue it, the worse off you'll be. So what is his solution? And this is where I don't completely agree, but I think he's closer to the mark. He said, you have to take responsibility. You have to, what he means is to use what you have to affect a greater good. So like if your dad dies, you have to be there to comfort the rest of your family. Try not to be useless. And he said, you know what? When you try to do what is good, you stop being resentful about life. And I could tell you, I began to see that, you know, I functioned better when my goal was not to try to feel better, when my goal was to do what was right. And then I felt better. When my goal was to make myself happy, I ended up being miserable. Okay. And since this channel does cater to graduate students, I think you could probably relate on some level, because when you pursue what you feel you've been called to do, then you end up being happy. If you pursue trying to be happy, you're not going to go to graduate school, because there's a lot of misery and tediousness. And sometimes the reason I do these torturous readings of peer-reviewed articles, I said, this is what life as a researcher is like. It's not pleasant. But in the end, you learn something, and it draws you closer to God, because you see the complexity and wonder of the world. And there may be some more gems in this article. I may read it some other time, or I may actually find some original source material by Jordan Peterson. He's just so rich in his understanding that I didn't hear in the Christian church. So sometimes he will say things and it'll remind me of the teachings of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And Jesus kept saying, you know, take up your cross each day. He who seeks to save his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will gain it. And now that I'm older, it makes sense, because when you see the futility of life, that it's a vapor, and that so much of human ambition is just going to end when the solar system dies, when the universe dies, it began to give me a different perspective. And, you know, I'm embarrassed to say I kept a very naive view that was insufficient. We call it kind of a romanticized view of life for a very long time. Kept thinking about happily ever after. And, you know, people have said that that romanticized view is also, can sometimes be a form of atheism, because if you look at the way reality is in a fallen world, it can be so depressing that you could be a nihilist, or you could escape to unreality and just kind of romanticize things and kind of close your eyes to the bad. I mean, what else can you do? As it says in 1 Corinthians, if the dead are not raised, if Christ is not raised, then your faith is in vain. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And you know, kind of that romanticism of, like, say, John Stuart Mill and others was a form of escapism. And so it's like eating and drinking. You're just trying to soothe the pain and get some anesthesia for it, because reality is too painful to deal with. And I have to confess, and now I look back at myself and it's ridiculous. When I was depressed about the world, what would I do? I'd watch a movie with a happy ending. And it would just make me feel like, oh, the world's such a good place and it's going to turn out okay. And I can't, you know, or I would get lost in sports. I mean, I was a big sports fanatic. I watch football games, and at least when your team is having a good season and they're winning at least more games than they're losing, you just feel happy. And I'm just like, well, you know, that really didn't solve the human condition. It just kind of got your mind escaping away from it. And I get that, you know, you need a little bit of rest from just getting all those negative feelings, you know, rest your nervous system. And I get that. But it's not the ultimate solution to the human condition. Jesus is. Jesus is. So, you know, so now I'm realizing the words of our Lord and Savior, to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow him. And early on in my life, I just didn't get it. I said, why would a loving God do this to me? And now it's starting to make sense so much later. And I wish Christian pastors had shared that with me throughout my life, and they haven't. A lot of them define Christian living as just being a preacher, which is what a lot of them were. Just go out there and preach. It didn't inspire a lot of love or belief in the Lord. It didn't inspire faith and love. And so the mission of this channel is to try to inspire faith in the Lord. When you have faith in the Lord, you trust his word, you have hope, and that inspires love. So now, changing the topic, last on the docket was about Antony Flew. I won't really cover it much. He was a notorious atheist, and he changed his mind. He became a theist. So first he said there is no God, and now he said before he died there is a God. I think sadly, I don't think he accepted Jesus Christ. We don't know that for a fact. I hope that he did, even if it were a deathbed confession, because he'd gone so far from denying God to accepting him. Now, this is another book that is sat on my shelf and I've never read it, and I'm embarrassed now. So I just thought I'd mention that. I find the testimony of atheists like Bertrand Russell, and then atheists who became Christians, or atheists that have become theists, to be very, very compelling. So maybe at some point I shall read through some of this. And his writing style is very accessible. Just flipping through it. And most of you know I really detest philosophy, but I think Flew might give me a better taste of philosophy. Another atheist that I really respect is Tom Holland. It's very interesting. He said his values are totally Christian. He wish it were true. He's having a problem because of evolution theory and dinosaurs. And I'm like, you know, this is what makes the material on this channel to me so important. There could be atheists out there like Tom Holland, and if they have any scientific background and are willing to be open and to actually hear better arguments than some of the ones that are floating around by other creationists, and I'm going to try to avoid naming names right now because that's getting me in hot water. If they can get good arguments that they could see, even if there's a hint that creationism is true, then they might become Christians. Because that's, even though I was never an atheist, that's kind of where I have been coming from, is I didn't need full proof. Of course, you know, the critics, the anti-theists especially, will say, you haven't proven it, you haven't proven it. I could go back to them and say, you haven't proven your beliefs either. In fact, as a matter of principle, you can't. You're walking on faith. And they'll say, what do you mean? I don't believe in God. And I say, well, okay, you believe in right and wrong, don't you? Or at least you're living by principles that there is a right and wrong, because certainly people like P.Z. Myers are on a rampage to correct society. So they inherently say, without admitting to it, that they believe there's something right and wrong. but they can't justify it in terms of science. How can you use science to tell you what is right, what ought to be done? They can't do it. It would be a non sequitur. Therefore, what they conclude is right and wrong is a matter of faith. And they don't want to admit that it's just, then the recourse is to admit if it's not a matter of faith, it's just their whims, and then therefore there's really no sense of right and wrong anyway. But they act as if there is some transcendent truth that says this is right and this is wrong. It violates their own, claims that they're all about facts and evidence, because the moment they start invoking ideas of right and wrong, they can't justify it. They can't justify it from their materialist worldview, their atheistic worldview. It can't be justified. It is, at best, a faith statement, or at worst, something that is incongruous with their atheistic view. So I don't know how I got on that tangent there. But anyway, people have wondered, and Dapper Dinosaur, my friend, he said, Sal, young Earth creation is going to fail in a few hundred years. And I was like, I don't think so. And there's no point in he and I having a confrontation, because we're friends. We're just going to have to disagree. What we can do is explore the question from a scientific standpoint. He hasn't, I can almost say, and I know this sounds like total shameless self-promotion, and it is, he probably hasn't encountered many young Earth creationists like myself. Most of the people he's dealt with may not have given compelling arguments, or at least not very thorough. What made me, first of all, believe that the solar system did not evolve? So independent of the age of the solar system, can we say that it happened through a process of what they call solar system evolution? And the title of the book that made me a creationist for the solar system is this book, Solar System Evolution by Stuart Ross Taylor. Now, this is like a 30-year-old book, but nothing in it has changed. If anything, the case for solar system evolution has gotten worse over time because it violates basic physics. And when I read this, it was after I have 5 science degrees. After my 3rd degree, which was in mathematics with a minor in physics, I could read this book and realize whenever it said that there are problems, I'm just like, yeah, no kidding, in solar system evolution. Whenever he would say that there are problems in this, I'm like, you're totally understating just how bad it is. It is a deal breaker. But the irony is, in the preface, or was it the introduction? Somewhere in the introduction, he said, I should have looked at, one day I'll find it. If you'll give me a moment, if I can't find it, I'm just going to, I'm trying to look for the quote. He explicitly said, I'm going to look for it, and I apologize to the viewers that I don't have this, that I didn't look for it earlier. But So there's a prologue. Okay, apologies. I don't have time to look it up. He specifically said he wrote this book to fight creationism. Specifically wrote this book. And the funny irony is he couldn't have written a better book to persuade someone with my background that God did it. And so I'm going to read, let me look at the docket here because I have the page numbers here. Page 62 through 64, just to get you a flavor of this. And you could see kind of some of the mechanical difficulties. Page 62 through 64. What was the lifetime of the solar nebula as a rotating disk of dust and gas? So the idea is that the solar system started as a rotating disk of dust and gas. What was the lifetime of the solar nebula as a rotating disk of dust and gas? From its separation from the molecular cloud until it broke up into a protosun and planetesimals. Clearly, one has to form the sun and gaseous rich planets while the gas is around, like duh. The timescale for the initial cloud collapse to protosun ignition and nebular removal is about 10 to the 5th to 10 to the 6th years, on the same order as the freefall time and similar to the lifetime of Tauri stars. The actual formation time of the nebular disk is much less than the time needed for core collapse, and probably occupies less than 10 to the 5th years. Once the sun begins to shine, the gas left over in the nebula is soon driven away. Heat is pushing it out, okay? Although we see the dusty disks of ice and rock persist for periods of a few million years around violently behaving young stars such as T Tauri, the gas itself may have been lost on a much shorter time, perhaps as brief as 1 million years. The time between the formation of the solar nebula as a rotating disk of dust and gas and the disappearance of gas is very short. Thus, the gas giants Jupiter and Saturn have to form rather quickly before the gas has been driven away. As will become apparent, some fine timing is needed to form Jupiter at all. Some fine timing is needed to form Jupiter at all. I mean, that's another way of saying it had to be a miracle. So the sun ignites. The fact that the sun ignites and you have the material needed to make Jupiter is floating out there. The probability is it's going to blow that gas, all that material away. It's going to blow it away. So once it ignites, fortuitously, Jupiter has to then form. And I'm just like, you got to be kidding me. And then you have the problem of all these different chemistries. You know, each planet has a different chemistry. So let me just skip to some more problems. The problem of the outward transfer of angular momentum, J, has been a classic dilemma for models attempting to explain the origin of the solar system. Binary systems of low mass stars have high angular momenta, about 10 to the 3rd times that of the solar system and 10 to the 5th that of the sun. This is fairly convincing astronomical evidence that the angular momentum of binary stars is not derived from the general galactic rotation, but probably results from turbulence or disordered motions in clouds within the galaxies, another fortuitous accident. Stars of about 1 solar mass have less angular momentum than more massive stars, and the values for the sun seem to be typical of other low mass single stars. So it may be an intrinsic property of such stars. The sun has 99.9% of the mass of the solar system, but rotates very slowly in about 25 days at the equator. It contains only about 2% of the angular momentum, most of the rest residing in Jupiter. This is an ancient paradox, difficult to accomplish with a symmetrical disk. It is the rock on which most theories for the formation of the solar systems have foundered. This problem caused the eclipse of the Laplacian models and led to the rise of tidal theories, which in turn succumbed. It was long ago pointed out that the angular momentum of the passing star in such tidal hypotheses was insufficient to account for that of the solar system. This is a persistent problem. You can go to Talk Origins and they say, well, there is some theory that refuted that in 1965. This was written in 1990. So that theory is disregarded. And so I know in Talk Origins, the topics that they don't cover are the problems for evolutionary theory. That's how I know. And, I still may do a show on debate tactics, and I'll relate it to World War II aviation and fighter tactics. Don't fight the enemy on ground of his choosing. The typical creationist tactic, and in fact, there's a saying, if you find yourself in a fair fight, if you're a fighter pilot and you engage in a fair fight, your tactics suck. That was by a famous Top Gun hero, Randy Duke Cunningham, fighter ace. And so the typical knee-jerk reaction of a creationist is an evolutionist will make a claim. You'll go and try to attack the claim head on. Like, you don't do that. What you do is you'll say that claim is moot because here's a bigger problem. And so, you might have someone like Erica Gutsick-Gibbon. We've agreed never to debate each other because we are friends. We will have conversations. We'll have disagreements. But let's say hypothetically we weren't friends. I would not debate her on chimp-human common ancestry or human evolution. She'll try to prove evolutionary theory from her field of specialty, which is primatology. And she'll make a very good argument. I will not fight her on that ground. What I would do instead is, first of all, say, evolutionary theory does not explain the origin of life, even by your admission. And if we go to the chemistry and physics and statistics of this, it's a miracle. She will not prevail in that argument. Why do I know that? Look how James Stewart just bludgeoned Dave Farina. It'd be the same set of arguments. In a standard debate, that's the other thing. In a short timed debate with a timed limit, the other side can use Brandolini's law, which means it's the BS asymmetry principle. So Dave Farina can use 20 minutes spewing garbage. It takes James Stewart 10 hours to refute it on video and probably another 40 hours of research. So don't fight in a short debate format unless it's for purely advertising purposes. Nothing will really get truly settled in a short debate format where one party can leverage Brandolini's law. So that's another fighter tactic. The other thing is, I'd say, even granting human evolution from primate ancestors, it doesn't solve the problem of eukaryotic evolution or any number of very major transitions, the origin of proteins. It would be a non sequitur to extrapolate what happens, what even supposedly happens in chimp-human ancestry, to use that as a guideline for what happens at the molecular level. Same for anything in the interpretation of the fossil record, even under the assumption of old Earth. You cannot extrapolate what happens at the macro level that way to molecular evolution. And so that's how that argument would play out. And James Downard found out what it was like to fight an unfair fight. He came at one angle trying to talk about eukaryotic evolution in terms of symbiotic theory, and I clobbered him because I talked about membrane organelles. And localization transport. He just got blown away. He didn't know how to handle it. And that's the way you win that argument. So when you look at the talk origin site, which I reference, or any other evolutionary literature, the areas where they talk about the most, the creationists do not engage it in general. Engage the stuff they have no answer for, and there are plenty of that. And I can't believe the creationists are choosing to fight on the grounds of the evolutionary biologists. Another example, recently, topoisomerase. Been talking about that for 3 years. Joe DeWeese talked about topoisomerase. Do you see anywhere on the net where they're trying to debate that or debunk it? No, that's because they don't have any answers. So if you're in a debate, why don't you use that? Why do you keep going after Linsky's experiments or chimp human ancestry? Start with stuff like topoisomerase, eukaryotic evolution, origin of life. Then you can go back and criticize Linsky's experiment. And there's some good things that you can extract, but you have to really dig deep in the weeds. So solar system evolution, you look at the problems in planetary formation, there is a gold mine. Now, some of what I read was very technical, but you just, you know, for the physics students out there, this resonated. It resonated with me. I said, this is such basic mechanics. It's staring you in the face that this doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint. It does make sense from the idea of a creator creating a solar system that cannot be explained in terms of evolution. It's best explained by a miracle. Okay, so I'll close with page 178, and this is rich with that. Oh, thank you for the kind words, Schnoil. He loved that debate with me and James Downward. Yeah, it was a cordial debate for the most part, probably one of the better cordial debates. But on substance, I think poor James got hammered. He thought he would have it. He would have an easy time with me, and I sprung stuff on him with nuclear localization signals, membrane-bound organelles, topoisomerases. I think he was just the nuclear pore complex. I think he just got blown out of the water. It's like, yeah, James, you need to account for all that before you assert that it evolved. I got another bot. Shot him down. So me and Janet did a good job tonight, just shooting down the bad guys. So this is page 178. I paid a lot of money for this book. In today's dollars, it'd be $200. But it helped save my soul. Praise the Lord. This is the chapter on building planets. And it says here, although the model, that is the model for building planets, although this model is able to account for some features of the system, the author concludes that a number of apparently intractable problems remain. A number of apparently intractable problems remains. I would not say apparently, definitely intractable problems remain. Thus, and quote, the rotational orientation of Uranus and of Pluto, essentially in the elliptic plane, remains unexplained except by supposing a formation from a pathologically strange initial cloud motion. A pathologically strange initial cloud motion. Like something that's practically impossible. Okay. A collision with another body of sufficient magnitude to cause the effect would be difficult to construct on the present arguments. The model does not explain the slow retrograde rotation of Venus. There's no explanation for the occurrence of pairs of bodies, in particularly of the Earth-Moon system. This remains a difficult problem. Okay. Let me see if I could find a picture of what I'm trying to convey. And yes, hang on. I got a picture. The problem is fundamentally if one is asserting gravity and random events can create something that has a particular organization that shouldn't be created by gravity and random events, one has a problem. The structure, if we wanted to convey design to someone, we would take materials and organize them in a way that it can't be explained in terms of a series or a process of events that would maximize uncertainty. So one way to define randomness, I guess even colloquially or maybe even formally, is a process that would maximize uncertainty over time. Like if I had a collection of Scrabble letters and it had kind of nice English words, and you put the Scrabble letters at the bottom of a box and you start shaking the letters, that would be a randomizing process. You would have no idea how it would be configured. What little organization there was is quickly gone. The problem with solar system evolution is there's an organization there that it's kind of like this house of cards. It's like it's organized in a way that it couldn't evolve naturally given just gravity and random chance unless you had very fortuitous sets of events. One of those, for example, is the fact we have all these planetary rings. And I've seen this in the peer-reviewed literature. They said this is so strange. We have all these planetary rings that shouldn't be there for very long. And yet they all appear at the same time in the same epoch, the same era. The odds of this just seem really remote and strange. It cannot be explained by law. It's a very strange set of coincidences. Like an example is, like if you have 500 fair coins and they're all heads, I mean, you encounter a collection where they're all heads. That can't be explained by random chance. So why would random events, that's the current theory of how the solar system evolved, is a bunch of random events. How can you have a bunch of random events that will somehow conspire to force the breakup of planetary material to form rings, and then the rings shouldn't last more than tens of millions of years, they should all disappear? Why should you find so many around all the planets? That seems like a strange coincidence. So as I read through this book, I just like, everywhere I turned, it was like this house of cards here. It had an organization that was not consistent with a randomizing process. There were too many coincidences that it was just kind of put together in a quirky manner that kind of told you, okay, this is not the natural expectation of how you would expect this to come to be. And even some things as basic as, okay, you look at the chemistry of Earth. All right, if you had the nebula from which we all evolved, granted you have the sun that can drive material out but how did you get all these heavy elements just floating around kind of the inner solar system to make the Earth? I found that kind of interesting. But even beyond that, okay, so we might come up with some theory that, it didn't get driven off by the heat of the sun when it ignited. Okay, I'll grant that. But why is our chemistry different than Venus or Mercury or Mars? How do you get those chemical differences? I've not gotten a satisfactory explanation in terms of orbital mechanics. And I may try to find more gems and kind of in the book where it really understates the difficulty. But someone with a physics background can just sense this is going to be a mess to solve, and the problem hasn't gotten any better. They'll say this is a theory, and there's some problems with it. And it's like, yeah, right. Just like the origin of life, there's some problems with it, or evolutionary theory. And then when you look at, it's not just some, it's like these are major, these are deal breaker. You get the impression that they could be solved, and they're like really major deal breakers. And you take someone like James Tour to analyze it, to tell you like these are not minor problems. It's a major deal breaker. It's a non-starter. You shouldn't pretend that you're even getting anywhere. So I just remember as I read through this book, it was intended to fight creationism. It had the opposite effect on me. I said, God did it. God did it. And that's why I'm a creationist with respect to the origin of the solar system. The mechanics declare, as it says throughout the Bible, the heavens, that would include the planets in the solar system, declare the glory of God. There's a mighty hand that put this together. Someone, what the source of the solar system is, as Sir Isaac Newton said, it testifies of an intelligent designer, not only intelligent, but very, very powerful. Any being that could form planets and put them in motion is very, very powerful. You can make the sun and the stars. It's overwhelming. So then the final question is, as far as young Earth creationism, okay, so I could say solar system creationism. Can we establish the age? And all the markers tend to point to youth, except radiometric dating. So if all the markers point to youth, the one thing we just need to solve is the apparent age of the isotopes. And we're moving forward in understanding the problem of what we call nucleosynthesis. So there's the video by Brian Nichol. It's really a video that is based on material of Dr. Walter Brown, who's a brilliant scientist, brilliant creation scientist. He got his PhD at MIT in 2 years. He's also a West Point graduate. Guy's just brilliant. And I also did a term paper at Johns Hopkins trying to rescue my grade at, in solid state physics. Professor said just any topic, hopefully a little bit of solid state related. And I kind of bent the rules, but I wanted, I was desperate to improve my grade so I could get a B instead of a C. I didn't get along too well with the professor in terms of his grading and teaching policies. Very sweet guy, but it just didn't work. And I didn't function well in the class, but I said, to rescue my grade, I'm going to do an outrageous topic. The means of affecting nuclear structure and transmutation, that is changing one isotope or even one element to another through chemical and electrical means. And I thought he was going to take my head off. But what I did is I spent 2 days at the Hopkins Library looking at all the experiments involved in this, and my jaw dropped. And I said, you know, whatever caused Noah's flood might also be related to how we get certain isotopes on the Earth. One thing a lot of people in these debates don't want to address, and I can't believe it's not been thrown on the table more often. Supposedly, the origin of uranium came from an evolutionary process. Okay. Why is it that there's 70 times more uranium on the continents than the seafloor, which would suggest there's maybe almost no uranium toward the center of the planet? We don't know that for sure. Why would that happen? I mean, if we all evolved from a nebula, shouldn't uranium be a little bit more evenly distributed instead of having 70 times more on the continental shelves? This would suggest then that some other mechanism may have been the origin of the Earth's radioactivity. And the nucleosynthesis problem, despite what you hear in the popular press, is still very difficult. I took cosmology and astrophysics, and it's like some of the heavy elements are kind of hard to make, in a stellar process. There are some controversial experiments that suggest you can generate these heavy elements through electricity. And my professor said that, when I provided some of the peer-reviewed experiments, he said that was the topic of the night. And first I pointed out lightning creates neutrons, and then I pointed out about experiments where they put electricity through a wire. It caused what they call a Z-pinch and create basically some sort of nuclear reaction. And he said, "Oh yes, that would make sense. That it would make neutrons. You could have enough." He said, "Yeah, that's right." And he said that was the topic of the night. I made the presentation in front of the other graduate students, and he singled my presentation out. That saved my grade, thank God. But more importantly, it gave me hope. I said, you know what? The problem of maybe solving the nucleosynthesis, one, it's exciting if we're able to come up with a different theory of nucleosynthesis of radioactive materials. That would be a major advancement for science and also young Earth creationism. And it would bring coherency to the idea that the solar system is young. It would solve a lot. It would be an exciting scientific exploration. It'd improve our understanding of nuclear processes and nucleosynthesis, maybe lead to better green energy methods, because if we can do nuclear reactions at with lower energies, then we might be able to find better sources of green energy than the big nuclear reactors and then the quote-unquote fossil fuels. So I'm very excited for our future, for those of us who are young solar system creationists, which would mean you're also a young Earth creationist if you're a young solar system creationist. And there are other things in this book. As I studied it, I'm just like, yeah, there's a lot more hope for the creationist young solar system creation model than the other side gives us credit for. And so we can praise God for that, because then there is hope. Going back to the topic of Jordan Peterson, he was believing God. He was practicing when he was kind of in a strange situation where on some level he was an atheist, but then living as if he were a Christian. I get how he could be that way, because he may not have been satisfied with the physical evidence indicating that the Christian God is real. But if the data keeps coming in, and then we solve a few scientific problems, particularly radiometric dating, you would have evidence that the Christian faith, that a literal interpretation of the genealogy of Luke in chapter 3 is very tenable. It's very believable. Therefore, the Christian scriptures can be trusted. If they can be trusted, we then have faith that they're inspired by the Christian God. And so with that, I close tonight's stream with those thoughts. You've heard me argue a lot of biology. That's because that's where the harvest has been rich and relatively easy to communicate. Planetary evolution's a difficult topic, and it's going to be challenging to explain it, but I hope I've given at least enough to give food for thought that this could be an exciting frontier for creationists, because it's just, to me, just very powerful. And seeing, you know, in my lifetime, I've seen the origin of life, naturalistic origin of life overturned. I've seen the naturalistic explanation of eukaryotic evolution overturned. You heard it in my debate with James Downard. I think he got slapped silly. And it's not going to end. We're going to find more complexity the more that we study. I mean, you could just see it, because biology has so many capabilities that we cannot even parallel with our best technology. And now we're having evidence that the solar system is created by a miraculous act, just like life was created by a miraculous act. But in the case of the solar system, this would not only be a miraculous act in terms of intelligence, but also a miraculous act in terms of sheer power. The amount of power and majesty that is needed to create it would be godlike. And so a reasonable inference is God did it. So praise be to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I want to thank everyone who's joined this stream, both live and through recording. May you have a blessed day. And the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit. Have a good night.